Welcome to Our Montana. I'm Mike Penfold, and with me today I've got Wayne Chamberlin. Wayne was, I think honored is the right word, to take video for posterity of some of the really important people who were key in preserving some of our Montana wildlands. He took videos of a chap by the name of Bob Anderson. And today, I want to find out a little bit more about Bob. Tell me about Bob, because we're gonna see his videos.
Yes, Bob was a great guy. I knew him a little bit because he lived in Helena some. He had held office as a public service commissioner for the state of Montana at one time. And Bob was a small town Montana boy, grew up in Livingston. In high school, he and some friends did a tremendous amount of hiking and exploring in the mountains just south of Livingston there in the Absaroka Mountains. And he fell in love with Montana during those years. Bob was a real initiator of many great conservation projects. He was one of the co-founders of the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, one of the early members and active members of the Montana Wilderness Association. I knew him a little bit. I had that honor of knowing him. And Bob was a soft-spoken guy, like so many conservationists, as we talk about Bill Cunningham and his emphasis on humility, for instance. Bob was a soft-spoken guy, but he had these strong convictions about the wild places of Montana that deserve to be protected. He played a key role, and it was great fun for him, playing the role in the establishment of the Absaroka Beartooth, or as we call it around here in Livingston, the AB, I believe it's called, Wilderness. Bob played a significant role in the specifics of drawing up the boundaries for that wilderness. A great story here. When he was working in the basement of Teddy Roe's residence in suburban D.C., when Teddy Roe was a staffer for Senator Lee Metcalf. Bob, along with Bill Cunningham, advice from Harrison Fagg from here in Billings, on a very informal, non-fancy, to the nth degree, plywood table set up in Teddy Roe's basement, maps all over the place. And Bob, with the others, with the limitations that he knew he had, drew the boundaries for what was to become the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness. And in the interviews that I did with him and other MWA personnel, Bob had this wonderful statement. When he was talking about that process, he described it as an out-of-body experience. A spiritual experience in his own way, knowing the importance of what he was doing, having that optimism that this would become designated wilderness, that being the highest form of protection for our Montana wildlands, where people are merely visitors, they don't live there, minimal impact as far as humans on the landscapes, the waters, the lakes, the forest, and everything else there.
Well, let me just start from the beginning.
Okay.
I grew up in Livingston, Montana, and early on, I was an outdoors kid, and I had two friends, Jay Sumner and Jerry McGinn, who were my cohorts. Our fathers were not outdoorsmen, and so us kids went out by ourselves, and we started exploring in the wilderness. Livingston is on the northwestern corner of the Absaroka Beartooth. It's now the wilderness. And we started exploring, and into our high school years, we attended a Bible camp up the Boulder River and explored up into the Beartooth. And we were always intrigued about what's over the next ridge. And Memorial Day weekend of 1960, Jerry McGinn and I climbed Emigrant Peak, which is in Paradise Valley, but it's on the west side of the Absaroka Beartooth. It's a high point, and from there you can see across the entire Absaroka Beartooth. You can see the Pilot and Index peaks. And we were so intrigued by that vast country that we could see. It was snow-capped at that time. It was in the spring. And we were just always wondering what was over the next ridge, and we explored as much as we could. And that was our bonding with the place. And I guess maybe that's one of the most common things about wilderness advocates is we become bonded with the place. And mine was the Absaroka Beartooth. This is the Absaroka Beartooth right here. Livingston is here. Gardner and Yellowstone Park down here. I just mentioned Emigrant Peak, it's right here. And Pilot and Index are clear over here. So you can see across the entire range, including these high plateaus. This is the highest part of Montana. The high point in Montana is here. And it's high, rugged, granitic, Precambrian, metamorphic rock, and much of it above timberline. And it's just the most marvelous place. So back in the 30s, 1932, the Forest Service established a couple of primitive areas, the Beartooth and the Absaroka. And between them is the Boulder River, which over a pass then goes south. The trail goes south through Slough Creek into Yellowstone Park. And this is what became the controversy of the whole area. This corridor. There were people who wanted to build a road through there. The road went quite a ways up the Boulder River, but some people wanted to continue that road over the top to Cook City. And that was the major issue with the whole thing. When the Wilderness Act was passed in 1964, it required that the Forest Service study the primitive areas and make a recommendation to Congress on their suitability for wilderness protection. So in the late 60s, the Forest Service began to do that. In the meantime, I graduated from high school in 1961, went to college at Bozeman in Missoula, and I worked in Denver in the late 60s as a consulting engineer. And then I came back to Montana in 1970, in January of 1970. The Forest Service had begun its analysis and study of the Absaroka and Beartooth primitive areas. And I was entirely clueless about any environmental or wilderness politics. My only interest or knowledge in politics was just as a reader, an observer, and a talker. You know, we talked politics, but none of us was engaged in it. Well, in the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, and sometime in the early spring of 1970, I saw an article that said the Forest Service was holding a meeting on the Absaroka Beartooth primitive areas study, the wilderness study. And so I thought, wow, this is my home territory, and so I better go attend this meeting. And so I did. And it was in a room in the Forest Service with a big long table, and all the special interests were there: logging and snowmobiling and mining and grazing and so on. But there weren't any wilderness advocates there. And I thought, boy, this is a pretty important thing, and I better get involved in this. And that was really my baptism as a wilderness advocate and a participant in environmental politics. And so I did something that turned out to be clever. I formed an organization called the Absaroka Beartooth Task Force. It was really a sham organization. My purpose was to give myself legitimacy. So I could say, I'm Bob Anderson, I'm from the Absaroka Beartooth Task Force. Well, I did have names. There were some people who agreed to be associated with it. Jay Sumner was one. He was one of my childhood friends. John Craighead, the wildlife biologist, was one. My first cousin, Jim Anderson, was another. It was he and I who really got the bug to prevent a road up the Slough Creek corridor. Others included Joe Elliott, who was a botanist, Mick Gonsier, who was an engineer who worked for the Forest Service Research Station, Jim Huffman, who was a law student at the time. Don White was a Bozeman attorney. Jerry Nielsen, the soil scientist, might have been on that list too. Anyway, none of them did very much except to say yes to be a part of this so-called task force. But that gave me legitimacy, and so I participated in the first sort of study process as the Absaroka Beartooth Task Force, and I needed to have some kind of a portfolio, and that was it. In the meantime, the Montana Wilderness Association formed two committees, a Beartooth Committee and an Absaroka Committee. Ruth Koch from Butte chaired the Beartooth Committee, and Joe Halterman, the Absaroka Committee. Joe Halterman was ill, didn't really do too much, although he may have written a report. I don't recall his report. Ruth Koch, however, was very active and she and her family had a cabin on East Rosebud Lake, and she spent many, many summers hiking in and around the Beartooth, and the Beartooth was her baby, and she didn't want it threatened by having it attached to the Absaroka, because she felt like the Beartooth was ready to go, that it could be recommended to Congress as a wilderness. At the Montana Wilderness Association meeting in December of 1970, my colleague Jay Sumner attended that meeting and reported back that MWA had not taken a policy position on the Beartooth or the Absaroka. And that gave me some time. So during that time, not only did I hike the whole area, and I spent every waking moment when the weather would allow, or the snow would allow, backpacking in the area to know it better. Most of my knowledge was on that Boulder and northwest part of the range. I knew much less about the eastern part of it. And so I hiked all over the area and learned it better. And I wrote a report. That was the report of the Absaroka Beartooth Task Force, which was issued in November of 1971. I don't know if you have a copy of the report on your bookshelf. It should be there because it's a historical piece. The first part was just about the wilderness concept, traced the concept, including its legal protection and so on, and the Wilderness Act of '64. And the second part was about the Absaroka Beartooth, and I analyzed all the resource conflicts and talked about the landscape and so on, and concluded, no surprise, this ought to be protected as wilderness. The principal conclusion was it ought to be united, that the Absaroka and the Beartooth primitive area should not be separated, that there ought to be a single wilderness, and the Slough Creek corridor should be a part of it. And that report included a map, a big fold-out map, and it had boundaries. The report was issued November 1st of 1971. My cousin Jim had been killed, I think in March of '71 in a plane crash. And the night before he was killed, he impregnated his wife. And she was 8 months pregnant in October of 1970, and she typed the manuscript of that report with this big belly. That was her following through. And their little son, Jimmy, was born December 18th of that year. So this report was issued, and there was no annual meeting in 1971. The 71 annual meeting of MWA was held in January of '72. So I went to that meeting. I wasn't even an MWA member, but I went to the council, or to the annual meeting, and I approached the council and I proposed that the council support the unified Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness proposal, and I had the map. And the council was divided. Ruth Koch was against me. She thought, this is going to jeopardize the Beartooth. And her concern was legitimate. This was a bold and a risky proposition. But I got support on the council from Cecil Garland, who was the president at the time, and Liz Smith, who were two of my mentors. And the council voted to support my proposition. And then, from then on, MWA was the proponent of that united proposition. I'm looking at some notes. These are notes that I prepared for a presentation at MWA in 1998.
Oh, really?
The meeting was in Billings, and they asked me to be on a panel to talk about some of the history. So I pulled out these old notes, and part of this is the chronology. So January of '72, MWA established the position for a united Absaroka Beartooth. So from then on, it was building support for that position. The Forest Service, part of the problem was this northern part here was called the North Absaroka. It wasn't even part of the Forest Service study. The Absaroka primitive area was in the southern part here, and the Beartooth was over here. This extension up here wasn't part of the study, and part of the process required that they have a mineral study. Congress required that so that they could see if they established a wilderness that would minimize conflicts with potential mineral development. They didn't have the study for that part of it, so that was a problem. But in due time, the politics forced them to actually do that. But the Forest Service came out with its proposal in February of 1974. And the Forest Service proposed 3 wildernesses. They proposed an Absaroka here, a Beartooth, and then a little isolated one called Cutoff Mountain, which was next to Slough Creek. They wanted to preserve not just the corridor down Slough Creek into Yellowstone, but also a road corridor to Cook City. And we, supporters of the unified proposal, of course, were outraged and organized against it, and for our own proposal. And there was tremendous public support. The Forest Service had hearings in Cody, Billings, and Livingston in March of 1974. So in the meantime, I had gone to graduate school at the University of Michigan from '72 to February of '75. So in '74, the hearings were held, but I made a special trip from Ann Arbor to help organize and attend these hearings. And they were well attended, and there was tremendous support for our proposal. And the Forest Service, in the end, lost because, in fast forwarding, of course, now we know it's one big wilderness. So I came back to Montana in '75 and got engaged again. I worked for the state of Montana for the Department of Natural Resources on a research project involving the Yellowstone River. So that was another part of my home territory. But I was active in MWA, and in December of '76, I was elected vice president of MWA. I accepted that position somewhat reluctantly because I was a state bureaucrat, and it was kind of unseemly, for a government official to have a position like that. But I accepted it, not knowing that Tom Horowitz, who was the president at the time, he was maybe a 2-term president. I can't remember how many terms he served. But early on in '77, he resigned. There I was, the president of MWA, and I really felt uncomfortable, being an administrator for the Department of Natural Resources and MWA president. Although that was during the Tom Judge administration, and there was a lot of latitude given to people in those days. It was an era of expansive government and support for ideas and so on. But I thought, boy, I'll finish my term, but that's got to be that. So I did that, and then relinquished the post at the annual meeting in Livingston in December of '77. In the meantime, in August of '77, there was a hearing in Billings on the two bills. Lee Metcalf had introduced S-1670. There's a fellow named Randall Gloge from Billings who asked Lee Metcalf to sponsor the bill, and he said yes, and he introduced the bill. We tried to get Max Baucus to introduce it on the House side. He didn't, but Mo Udall did, and so there was a companion bill. Actually, it was an omnibus bill that Mo Udall had that he put the Beartooth bill into. So there was a hearing in Washington in September of '77, and then, or September, on S-1670, and then in October on H.R. 1907, the House bill. So then there was a stroke of good fortune in a way. It's ironic. It wasn't good fortune in any other way except for the Absaroka Beartooth, and that was that in January of '78, Lee Metcalf died. And Scoop Jackson, who was a powerful senator from Washington, decided that there should be a memorial bill passed in Metcalf's name, and the Absaroka Beartooth bill became his memorial. And John Melcher, the other senator, was nothing but trouble through this whole process, and he messed with it. He was carrying water for the Anaconda Company, which had mineral interests in the Stillwater. And Melcher could not stop the bill because Scoop Jackson was bound and determined that this was going to pass as a memorial to Lee Metcalf. And so it did pass in March of 1978. And that was during the time when you could do something like that.
Yeah.
You can't do that anymore. But it's a marvelous thing. I have an original signed copy of the bill in my possession. And one of the most powerful experiences in my whole life was drawing the boundary of the wilderness. The way the wilderness bills work, there's language that says the boundary is established in accordance with maps on file with the committee of jurisdiction. And so the Senate Interior Committee, I forget if it's the correct name at that time, but the staffer for Lee Metcalf was Teddy Rowe, who now lives in Billings. Teddy was a fantastic champion for us. He helped us succeed in a marvelous way. Teddy brought home to his house in Northern Virginia all the USGS quadrangle maps, and we laid them out on the floor. It was a huge floor, and we laid all these maps out. And I went around with a pen and drew the boundary all the way around. And it was an out-of-body experience, because it was like I was flying over the landscape, and I was seeing the drainages, and I was seeing the rivers and the plateaus, and I was actually drawing that line all the way around. And it took quite a while. And I was very careful, and I was respectful of the record that had been developed. The Absaroka Beartooth Task Force map was really the basis for it, but through the hearing process, there were arguments made for boundary changes and so on. So there was a record that supported the boundary that I drew. I had to resist temptations to grab extra wilderness. But drawing that boundary around there was the most wonderful thing. And I presume those maps are still on file. So that's the Absaroka Beartooth story. Then after that, Rick Gratz, who was the publisher of Montana Magazine, came to me and he said, "I want you to do a book on the Absaroka Beartooth." And I really didn't want to do it. I hated drawing attention to my favorite places. And I said, "Yeah, I'll do it." And, time went by, and he would call up and say, "How you doing on that project?" And I would procrastinate and make excuses. And finally, Rick called me up and he said, "Look, if you don't come through on this, I'm going to get somebody else." He had me right there. And so I did complete the book, although it took way longer than I expected. But there's a result, and it's right here. This is the second edition. The first edition was published in 1984. The second edition was 1994. And it's really, I think it's a neat book. It has, I should have the first edition because it's got some fold-out photographs that were taken in the 1890s by a Norwegian photographer named Anders Wilsey, and marvelous black and white panoramic photographs. And I have the original prints from that, and they were given to me by a guy named Tom Koch from Hamilton. Tom's father was Ehlers Koch, who was a longtime Forest Service bureaucrat. He rose as high as, I think, the deputy regional forester. Ehlers Koch was the first person to climb Granite Peak. And that story's in the book.
Okay.
But along the way, I was helped by heroes and mentors.